He had fought bravely for his country, yet when he needed support, the system turned its back on him until Trump stepped in. The White House lawn stretched out under the golden afternoon sun, a vast expanse of crisp uniforms and shining medals reflecting the light. It was a day of ceremony flags waving, speeches paying tribute to the military, the national anthem soaring through the air a moment to honor service, sacrifice, and patriotism. At the center of it all stood President Donald Trump, shaking hands with generals, acknowledging the gratitude of high-ranking officers, and exchanging words with dignitaries. The cameras followed his every move, journalists scribbled furiously, and the world watched. But then, something caught his attention. On the outskirts of the crowd, just beyond the official seating, a lone Marine stood apart. He wasn't disengaged, far from it. His posture was rigid, his uniform immaculate, his ribbons perfectly aligned. Everything about him spoke of discipline. Yet it was his eyes that stopped Trump in his tracks there. Was something there, something heavy, something no medal could erase. Trump had met countless service members before, but this felt different. He paused, subtly signaling his aides and security to stay back. Then, without hesitation, he stepped away from the structured order of the event and began walking toward the Marine. The cameras wavered for a second, then swung sharply to capture the moment. Sergeant Daniel Briggs stiffened the instant he saw the president approaching. He'd been through enough formal events to know how these things worked. A handshake, a polite, "Thank you for your service," then on to the next. But this time, there was no quick handshake, no routine pleasantries. Instead, Trump studied him not with the look of a politician addressing a voter, but with the gaze of one man truly seeing another. Trump extended his hand. "What's your name, son?" Briggs hesitated for just a moment before answering. "Sergeant Daniel Briggs, sir." Trump clasped his hand firmly, holding it just a second longer than expected, his eyes never leaving Briggs's face. "You look like you've got a lot on your mind," he said, his tone quiet but direct. "What's going on?" Briggs swallowed. He could feel the weight of the cameras, the hundreds of eyes on him. He could have played it safe, given a polite response, and let the moment pass. But something about Trump's tone, the way he asked, the way he waited, made it impossible to brush off. He exhaled slowly, jaw tightening. "Sir, with all due respect, I'm not sure this is the right place." Trump shook his head. "Right place. Wrong place doesn't matter. Talk to me." Briggs hesitated again. Years of training had taught him to stay composed, to push forward without complaint. Marines didn't make excuses. Marines didn't ask for help. But here was the commander-in-chief standing right in front of him, genuinely listening. For the first time in a long time, it felt like someone in power actually cared. He drew a slow breath, locking eyes with Trump, and with the cameras rolling, the crowd hushed, and the world watching, Sergeant Briggs finally spoke. For 15 years, Sergeant Daniel Briggs had followed orders, suppressed emotions, and endured pain. But standing there, face to face with the President of the United States, something shifted. This wasn't a photo op. It wasn't political theater. Trump wasn't just hearing him, he was listening. Briggs steadied his voice, though the weight of his words was unmistakable. "I've served 15 years, sir. Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria. I've been in combat. I've lost brothers. I did my job. No complaints." His jaw tensed slightly before he continued. "But coming home, that's been the hardest part." Trump nodded slightly, absorbing every word, not in the way most politicians did, waiting for their turn to speak, but truly taking it in. Briggs exhaled, forcing himself to keep going. "My wife, Naomish, was a nurse, had to leave her job to take care of our son. He was born with cerebral palsy, needs full-time care." He paused, rubbing his thumb against his palm, the only outward sign of his frustration. "We tried everything. The VA, state assistance. Took months just to get someone on the phone. But the bills don't stop. The debt doesn't stop. I re-enlisted just to keep a paycheck coming. but now I'm out of options. We're drowning, sir. He hadn't meant to say that last part out loud, but there it was, raw, unfiltered, exposed. The words hung heavy between them, thick with meaning. Trump's expression remained unreadable, but something flickered in his eyes saw recognition, an understanding. He had seen this before, men who gave everything only to return home to nothing. Briggs swallowed hard. He wasn't looking for sympathy. He wasn't asking for charity. But if people really wanted to honor those who served, they had to do more than just wave flags and give speeches. If you believe in standing up for those who protect our country, hit that like button and let the world know. For the first time in years, Briggs wasn't just another soldier in a uniform. He was being heard. And that moment, more than any medal, more than any ceremony, was worth everything. If you want to see real change for our veterans, make sure you're subscribed. This is a story that needs to be told. All he wanted was to understand why it had to be this way. He forced himself to stand tall, pushing back against the raw emotions threatening to surface. He was a Marine, and Marines don't break. "I'm not asking for special treatment," he said, his voice steady now. "I just don't understand how a man can serve his country, risk his life for it, and come back to nothing." The silence that followed was thick, the kind that made people shift in their seats, the kind that made cameras zoom in, capturing every flicker of emotion. Trump exhaled sharply, his gaze darkening. "You're telling me you did your duty, and the government turned its back on you?" Briggs met his stare. "Yes, sir." For a long second, neither of them spoke. The crowd, the press, the aides standing nearby, they all felt it. The weight of the truth. The rawness of it. Trump turned slightly, casting a sharp glance toward his team. Frustration flickered across his face before resolve took over. "Where's my chief of staff?" His voice cut through the moment like a blade. An aide scrambled away. Briggs blinked, his mind racing. He had been in the system long enough to know how these things worked. Politicians said they cared, made vague promises, then moved on. But this felt different. Trump turned back to him, his voice low but unwavering. "We're fixing this." For the first time in years, Briggs felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. Hope. The tension thickened as a White House aide rushed off. The press pool, once covering a routine event, snapped to full alert, microphones extended, cameras zoomed, producers whispering frantically into earpieces. Something was happening, something unscripted. Sergeant Daniel Briggs stood rigid, military discipline keeping him still, but his mind was racing. He had expected a handshake, maybe a few polite words, not this. Not the president putting the entire system on notice in front of the world. A few feet away, Trump crossed his arms, studying him carefully. "You said you reached out to the VA." His tone was sharp, measured. "How long did it take to get a response?" Briggs clenched his jaw. 8 months, sir. Even then, they only told us they were backlogged." A ripple of shock moved through the onlookers. 8 months. Some guests shifted uneasily. The press leaned in closer. Even a few military officials exchanged glances. Trump let out a sharp breath. "That's not just incompetence. That's a disgrace." His words cut through the murmurs, slicing through the political noise. "We have billions for foreign aid, billions for wasteful government programs, and you're telling me we can't take care of the men and women who fight for this country?" The murmurs grew louder. Just then, Tony O'Brien, Trump's chief of staff, appeared, slightly out of breath. "Mr. President," Trump didn't look away from Briggs. "This Marine has been left out to dry. His kid has cerebral palsy. His wife had to quit her job. The VA is doing nothing for them." O'Brien hesitated. "Sir, Trump raised a hand, cutting him off. "No excuses. I want his case on my desk today, and I want a full audit of VA delays every case like his, every soldier or Marine getting screwed over. I want names, numbers, reports, by tonight." O'Brien nodded quickly, already pulling out his phone. Briggs stood in stunned silence. He had spent years buried under government red tape, ignored by agencies that moved at a glacial pace. And now, in less than 2 minutes, the president had put the entire system into motion. Trump turned toward the gathered press, his voice firm, unwavering. "We love to say we support our troops, we love to say it. But what does that actually mean if we let them come home to this?" His words cut through the air like steel. If a man is willing to lay down his life for this country, then this country better damn well take care of him when he gets back. The statement hit hard. Even some of the reporters, the ones used to challenging him, stayed quiet. Because this wasn't politics. This was personal. Trump turned back to Briggs. "You said you weren't looking for a handout. Good, because you shouldn't have to." He extended his hand again. "I don't forget, people. We're fixing this. Today." Briggs hesitated for a fraction of a second, then grasped Trump's hand. His grip was strong, but his mind reeled. But this time, it was different. And as the press scrambled to capture the moment, one thing became undeniably clear: this story was far from over. The instant that handshake happened, the media lost control. Cameras flashed in rapid succession, reporters shouted over one another, and producers frantically worked to push the footage live. What had started as a simple military appreciation event had just transformed into something much bigger. "Mr. President, is this political standing?" one reporter called out. "Will this actually lead to change, or is this just a publicity stunt? What about the VA's budget? Where will the funding come from?" Trump, still gripping Briggs's hand, turned slightly toward the press but didn't let go. His voice sliced through the chaos like a blade. "I don't give a damn how this looks," he said, locking eyes with a CNN correspondent. "I care about results. This man served his country. His family is suffering. And I'm not going to let bureaucrats drown them in paperwork while his kid goes without care." For a fraction of a second, the reporters froze just long enough for the weight of his words to sink in. And then, all hell broke loose. Every major network cut into live coverage. Anchors scrambled to interpret what had just unfolded. Some called it bold leadership proof that Trump was taking real action. Others labeled it a calculated move to energize his base before an election cycle. Fox News ran with, "Trump fights for veterans' demands. VA reform immediately." CNN countered, "Trump uses struggling Marine as a political prop-R move or real reform." MSNBC featured an expert panel debating whether this was a genuine effort for change or just another dramatic headline that would fade by next week. But outside the media bubble, something much bigger was happening. For the first time in years, veterans across the country started speaking up. Former Army Ranger Mike Ramirez posted a viral tweet, "Sergeant Briggs isn't alone. I fought the VA for over a year just to get my PTSD treatment approved. This system is broken." Navy widow Jessica McAdams shared a heartbreaking story about her late husband, who had died waiting for medical care. The VA didn't just fail him, it killed him. Within hours, hashtags like #FixTheVA and #VeteransDeserveBetter were trending nationwide. And while social media erupted, a storm was brewing behind closed doors at VA headquarters. Phone lines were flooded with calls from the White House. High-ranking officials were summoned for emergency late-night meetings. The pressure was mounting, and for the first time in years, the VA had nowhere to hide. Meanwhile, in his modest Arlington home, Sergeant Briggs sat at his kitchen table, staring at the news playing on the small television across the room. His wife, Naomi, sat beside him, her fingers laced tightly around his. She had been quiet ever since the footage aired. Now she turned to him, her voice barely above a whisper. "You realize what you've started, right?" Briggs exhaled slowly. "I didn't start anything. I just told the truth." Naomi shook her head. "No, Daniel. You did something no one else could. You made them listen. But while the nation debated and veterans across the country found their voices, a different kind of battle had already begun. A silent war that could either bring real change or crush everything before it even had a chance. By morning, the footage of Trump and Sergeant Briggs had gone viral. But this time, it wasn't just political analysts watching, it was everyone. News networks dissected the moment in morning shows, opinion columns debated its significance, social media flooded with personal testimonies. Fox News declared it the moment Washington finally took veterans seriously. CNN framed it as a carefully orchestrated PR stunt. MSNBC asked, will this lead to real change? Or is it just another flash in the pan? But outside the world of television screens and headlines, something real was happening. Veterans, hundreds of thousands of them, began speaking out. Former Marine Greg Lawson posted, medically discharged with a spinal injury. Took me 2 years to get the VA to approve surgery. We're treated like we're disposable. National Guard widow Ashley Carter shared her pain. My husband took his own life after waiting 14 months for mental health treatment. I begged them to see him sooner. They told us to be patient. This was no longer just a story about one Marine. It had become something much bigger. It was a movement. If you believe our veterans deserve better, hit that like button. Let's make sure their voices are heard. Because this fight wasn't just about politics, it was about people. And if you want to follow what happens next, make sure you're subscribed. This is far from over. Within 48 hours, hashtags like #FixTheVetter and #VeteransDeserveBetter weren't just trending, they were #1 nationwide. For the first time in years, veterans weren't just venting in private. They were uniting. Inside Washington, panic set in. At VA headquarters, a late-night emergency meeting was called. The conference room was packed officials, bureaucrats, political aides all scrambling for answers. We need a statement, one official stammered, sweat beading on his forehead. Something that says we're handling this. Handling this? Another snapped. We've got the president demanding full reform, a national firestorm on our hands, and veterans calling us criminals. You think a press release is going to fix that? Silence. No one had an answer because this wasn't a PR problem. This was a structural failure, and now the entire country knew. Meanwhile, at the White House, Trump's Oval Office desk was covered in stacks of veteran case files. Some were stories just like Briggs months, even years of delays. Others were worse veterans who had died waiting for care, families who had lost everything fighting the system. Trump flipped through a file, shaking his head. This is worse than I thought. Tony O'Brien, his chief of staff, shifted uncomfortably. The VA has been broken for decades. Too much bureaucracy, too much wasted money. Trump's fingers drummed on the desk. Who's responsible for this mess? O'Brien hesitated. Technically, the VA secretary, but fire him. O'Brien exhaled. Mr. President, that's complicated. Firing a cabinet member over this will send shockwaves through the administration. Trump's stare didn't waver. Good. Maybe those shockwaves will wake people up. The next morning, news broke. Trump fires VA secretary in shock move, promises immediate reform. The media erupted. Some called it reckless. Others called it bold leadership. But among veterans, the reaction was different. For the first time in a long time, they saw something real, something that wasn't just words. Back at the Briggs home, Sergeant Briggs sat on his couch, scrolling through his phone. The glow of the screen lit up his face as message after message poured in. Some were from fellow Marines, thanking him for speaking up. Others were from reporters, begging for an exclusive interview. And then there were the threats. Anonymous emails, voicemails, calling him a pawn, a sellout, a liar. He clenched his jaw. He had faced enemy fire overseas. But this was something else. Naomi sat beside him, arms crossed. You're not reading those, are you? Briggs didn't answer. She exhaled, reaching for his hand. Listen to me. You didn't ask for this, I know that. But you did start something. Her voice softened. "And now you have to decide it. Oh, you keep fighting, or do you walk away?" His phone buzzed again. A call from the White House. Briggs exhaled. He already knew what was coming. He answered. "Yes, sir." Trump's voice was direct. "I need you in Washington tomorrow." Briggs hesitated. "Mr. President, No excuses," Trump interrupted. "I want you in the room when we overhaul the VA. You started this fight, and you're going to help me finish it." Briggs felt his heart hammer in his chest. He was just a Marine, not a politician. But walking away? That wasn't an option. And as he boarded a plane to Washington the next morning, one thing was clear: this wasn't just about him anymore. This was about every veteran who had ever been forgotten. And this time, they weren't going to be ignored.